Welcome to FaithCast, a Faith in the Forest ministry. Be sure to hit that notification bell to stay up to date on great new content. Now, here is your host, Pastor Keith.
Good morning and welcome to FaithCast. I'm hoping that I'll monkey with things a little bit here. So we are on episode number 4. Hope everybody's having a wonderful weekend. Please remember that if you don't get to see everything here, we will also have our rebroadcast on YouTube. And I'll talk more about that at the end of the episode here. So Sassy Dog's in the studio again this week. And so that's another thing. So when you go back over to YouTube and see the rebroadcast of this, I'm going to post a picture of Sassy so everybody knows like what Sassy Dog looks like every week when we're starting out here. I hope everybody's having a great morning. Kathy and I are in the studio with our coffee. And let's get right into this episode today. So today we're talking about the Jesus movement. And there's a few things to pick up about this, not only from the standpoint of what we're focusing on for this entire series, which is about the fact that Jesus has revealed himself in many different ways in our lives. In the secular lives that we live, there's still moments where Jesus is reminding us that he's there. And one of those ways is music. And so we'll talk about that today. But from the standpoint of the church reaching out to communities, today's episode is one of those things where if a church is really being an Acts 1:8 church, really being an outreach church, that you really can make huge changes in the world. And so this is one of those. Now, before we get into the actual story of the Jesus movement, which started in about 1969 up to 1979, and we start thinking about this as being some really off-the-wall, wow, it never happened before kind of thing, I want you to think back to all of the music that's been in the church for centuries. Because when the church first started, and when I say that, let's go to, first century church, past the point of the apostles growing the church in Jerusalem, and now let's go up to the point where Constantine accepts Jesus, accepts the truth of Christianity, and that's when we see the major churches start to be built, the big cathedrals that we see today. That all started because of Constantine. And back in those early days, when to go to church, it would be in Latin, and you can never understand what the priest was saying unless he spoke Latin. And the songs back then were just the Psalms. And in fact, if you read through the Psalms, it says a song of David, a song. Those were the first songs of the church. What we see as the Psalms in the Bible. And then things started to shift. And I find it interesting that people talk about how they don't like to have contemporary music. They don't like drums and guitars and stuff in the church, which is a debate that still goes on in some churches. But the organ at the time was somewhat of a controversial thing. The organ was brought into the church because an organ was one instrument that could represent an entire orchestra. And so they could have this huge sounding orchestra when you didn't have orchestras anymore. Once we got past the time of, the Renaissance. And so this music has been changing up to, so you sang the song Holy, 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 which is in pretty much every denomination's classic hymnal. And I don't have a hymnal with me today, but what's interesting is those songs, many of those songs, when they were written and put into the idea of church music, they use the melodies of like shanties and bar songs, and the reason being, they did it on purpose, and the reason being was that new converts would come in and the song would sound familiar to them. The words would be different, but the melody would be there. So it was like church's early copyright plagiarism before it existed, where they were taking, honestly, if you think about it, they were taking contemporary music of the time and twisting it into what we know as hymns, and then moving forward. You know, one of the, oh, yeah, it just popped into my brain, and now I wish I would have, I wish I would have brushed up on it. One of the most famous Christmas songs that we know, the gentleman who wrote it. Oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm drawing a complete blank on this. Anyhow, he was kicked out of the church for writing it, and today we see it as, because it was so controversial at the time, and today it's like one of the hymns, Christmas hymns that everybody sings all the time. So that's one of those things. I'll look it up again and brush up on it in the next episode. So this brings us up to the Jesus movement. And this is the start of contemporary Christian rock. And it started way back in 1969. And this is where I want churches that are doing outreach to think about this. It started in California, down in, I have it written down here, Costa Mesa, in 1969. And the way it started was there were a couple preachers that, you know, they had a church down there, but they were doing some street preaching. They were going out and talking to all of the artists, the musical artists that were congregating there, and sharing the love of Jesus Christ. And what's interesting, there's actually a song written about how during this time of the summer of love and the time of peace, and that's what everybody's looking for, that so many people, especially these songwriters, they were looking for that peace, but the peace of this world wasn't what they were finding, and so they were looking for something more profound, and there just became this desire to see the love of Jesus, not the religion. And it's interesting, I don't want to go way off on a tangent on this, but it's fascinating. During the anti-establishment period of the 1960s, where everybody was against, you know, the government and the schools and the churches, and much what we're seeing today, that they were looking for this enlightenment of peace, but what they were finding was, for many of them, was the truth of Jesus, which wasn't really being shared very well in the churches at the time. I mean, I wasn't old enough to have firsthand experience of this, but in the research I've done and in talking to people, it was that the churches at the time were, you know, it was all about pointing out your sins and your dogmas, and you better, you know, get things right. And, you know, that's when people started, you know, I don't go to church because I'm not good enough to go to church. And so, sorry, we get distracted when Sassy is looking for some love in here. So she's looking for the peace, the love. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting that in this time when people were turning away from the church and having arguments and conflict with the dogma of religion, they were still seeking the truth of Jesus Christ. And this is how the Jesus movement really got started. And it wasn't just a flash in the pan of history. This is something that has had profound, long-lasting effects in American culture to this day. And so when these pastors went out and they're talking to the basically folk singers and folk rock singers, and, you know, guys just sitting around and girls sitting around with, you know, their guitars on the beach, and so these artists started writing Christian songs, but not what you would hear in the church at the time. They were writing and sharing their faith in the way they knew how to express it with their music. They were using their passion to share the love of Jesus. And it became an entire genre of music. And so I could have sat here and just listed, honestly, a couple dozen artists that came out of that period that had great careers. I'm only going to mention two of them. One is, it was a rock band called Petra that they were more of a they had more of a heavy metal song. In fact, if nobody ever guessed it or nobody thought about it, the guitar riff that you hear at the beginning, if you listen to us on YouTube, which again I'm going to talk about before the end, if you listen to our YouTube broadcast, you will hear the guitar riff by Petra, which they didn't write that song. The song is called God Gave Rock and Roll to You. And it was written by a British band called Argent, which again came out of this time period. But then Petra took it as a Christian rock band, and they changed the words but kept the melody. And then in 1992 or something like that, Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey, Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. I think it was Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey. If anybody knows the movie, right? Keanu Reeves starred in it. The band Kiss, they took that song and they called it God Gave Rock and Roll to You too, changing the name because they changed the words and the melody. They tried to make the song their own. But it came from the biggest, the most well-known version of it is from Petra as a Christian rock band. The other one was Phil Keaggy. And many people might not know Phil Keaggy, that he came out of this Jesus movement of the 1960s, 1970s. And I share that to bring in another aspect of how important and how profound this movement was to music. And then we'll get to how it played just in the little parts of our lives. Because if we're just talking about an entire Christian musical genre, that's not the same as just secular songs that mention Jesus in them. This is an entire movement, and I'll get to where it plays into secular songs. But Phil Keaggy, I bring up because Kathy and I got to go see Phil Keaggy, right? Do you remember going to see Phil Keaggy? Right, just really, really talented guitarist, and he was one of the original, the Jesus movement from the 1970s. We got to see him up in Jamestown, New York. Why does that matter for the story of the Jesus movement? Because we saw him. Do you remember what church?
No.
Hosted that? So the church that hosted that was, I'm going to mute for a minute while I cough. So the church that hosted that was Calvary Chapel. And Calvary Chapel has its own Christian radio station, which plays a lot of this original Jesus movement music. Because Calvary Chapel is one of the denominations that formed specifically from this Jesus movement. There were multiple denominations that formed. I'm bringing up Calvary Chapel as one of the examples because they're one of the most well-known today denominations, branches, churches of the denomination are all over the country, and many of them still have this focus of where the roots of this music came from and how the church changed. In fact, when we served that one church, we had a broadcast out of the tower. They used, right? Calvary Chapel broadcasted a translator out of the steeple of our church. And that entire denomination came from the Jesus movement. So this was pretty big. It was big enough that I even remember that this Jesus movement slipped into mainstream media with, it's hard to say that because mainstream media today is different than it was back in the 1970s, but it was big enough that you could see it represented in movies. And one example is the 1970s movie Convoy, which was about a bunch of truckers boycotting, I can't remember the whole plot of the movie, but it was a whole bunch of truckers traveling around the country. And as this convoy kept growing and kept growing, one of the things that joined the convoy was one of these Jesus movement preachers, with his little vehicle and, his followers. They made him sort of look like a cult, but it was really the Jesus movement. I'd always remember seeing that movie. I always thought it was really cool. You're just shaking your head. You don't remember? So it was like things like that were always mentioned in the movies when it would represent the Jesus movement. And This is the beginning of what we see today. So in this part of the country, we listen to FLN, or people listen to The Message, and that is contemporary Christian rock. That is artists like, Chris Tomlin and Toby Mac, and some of the things that you sing in church today came from directly from this musical genre that started where people wanted to be able to use rock and roll and folk rock and country and folk to represent and express their love of Jesus. And it wasn't, like I said before, it wasn't a flash in the pan. It just kept growing. So not only did denominations form out of this and preaching of the truth, but a whole new genre came out of this that we now listen to regularly today, and became once again the subject of debate at many churches, that this contemporary modern music should not be in churches, that churches should only be the hymns, which were really bar songs, bar shanties, back in the day. So there's the history of the music of a genre. And now I want to share just a little bit of where it, during this time from 1969 to 1979, when you're seeing an entire musical genre being formed, and it's not going unnoticed. It's being seen in Hollywood. It's being seen, in the musical industry, and it's being seen by the mainstream artists. Because if I listed off all the names of the people who were truly part of this explicit Jesus movement, and they were only basically writing Christian songs, they didn't get a lot of airplay. They didn't get a lot of number one hits. You aren't going to see them, or be able to. I don't think most people would remember them unless you listen to that kind of music growing up. But for mainstream music, it's still fed over. And I looked through it. I picked seven. A couple I had to because they were so obvious as a switch, and then a couple because I think they'll surprise you when I talk about them for a minute. So the first one we talked about in week 1, Norman Greenbaum, Spirit in the Sky. He was touched by the Jesus movement. He had listened to Porter Wagner write a gospel song and thought, hey, I can write a gospel song. He comes up with Spirit in the Sky. Last week we talked about George Harrison's My Sweet Lord, which is not part of the Jesus movement, but a lot of people, and myself included, had always labeled it into that because it appears as though he's talking about Jesus, even though he's actually talking about his Hindu god, Krishna. But the time period was like right there, exactly the same time that the Jesus movement was starting, and so it just sort of got pushed into it. And the other one is artist by the name of Murray Head, which some people, if you know rock and roll, you've heard the name before. He did Jesus Christ Superstar in 1970, which originally was music. It was then put into a Broadway play. And what I didn't know was, okay, so in the original Jesus Christ Superstar, just the music of it, so Murray Head actually does the role of Judas in the song. I've never listened to Jesus Christ Superstar. Have you? I've never. As our technology grows on Faithcast and prayerfully we're able to grow this whole thing, I'm going to have a secret camera put on Kathy, so every time she's sitting over there just nodding her head, I'm actually going to put it up and make her be on camera. So
Put a GoPro on my head.
I'll put a GoPro on your head. See, this is Kathy. Nope. So no, you're not a lot of knowledge on Jesus Christ Superstar?
No, I know just a line from the song, and that's about all it goes.
Right. So What I didn't know was that Ian Gillan, who's the lead singer of Deep Purple, actually did the title role in Jesus Christ Superstar. I did not know that. So that's a mainstream. You've heard of the band Deep Purple. I know you have. So, that was a mainstream artist flipping over into the realm of the Jesus movement. And now here's a couple. One, most people know the Doobie Brothers in 1972 did Jesus Is Just All Right.
I remember that.
Okay. 1973, ZZ Top did. See, I wish you were on camera. I wish you guys could see like Kathy's reaction when I mentioned this. ZZ Top did a song called Jesus Just Left Chicago. And I've never heard the song either. I want to go back and I want to go listen to it because the storyline of it, I guess, is pretty good. It's about Jesus like leaving Chicago. He's taking classic historic Route 66 across America. The Velvet Underground, which in 1969, the Velvet Underground, the lead for the Velvet Underground was Lou Reed. So you've heard of Lou Reed, right? No. I mean, you've never heard of Lou Reed? I'm coming to think that my wife does not have a great musical background. So Lou Reed, who was originally the lead of the Velvet Underground, they did a song called Jesus. And 1973, this guy named Freddie Mercury. Do you know him?
I probably know his music. The name does sound vaguely familiar.
Vaguely familiar. He is the lead singer of Queen.
Oh, well, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, okay. So in 1973, Queen, Freddie Mercury actually wrote the song called Jesus. So it's 2 songs just called Jesus. And the most profound touch of the Jesus movement into rock and roll was in 1971. There was a song called After Forever. And I could give everybody 10 minutes to try and guess it. Somebody online would get it because they would just Google it. But it was by the band. Are you ready for this? Black Sabbath. Right? So Black Sabbath has historically been known as like almost a satanic, like heavy, and Ozzy Osbourne was the lead singer of Black Sabbath for a while. And you didn't know that?
Nope.
No. But they did a song called After Forever, which the words are, it's all about eternity and accepting Jesus Christ. It's about the fact that, and basically part of the song is as you're, I didn't listen to the song. I read an article on the research of this song. And basically what the guy in the article was saying was that the song is based on this kid quietly following Jesus Christ, but he doesn't tell anybody. And as you're doing all these rebellious, writing on the school desk and wearing your black t-shirts and doing all the, what would your friends think if they really knew that, you actually follow Jesus Christ? And that's what the song's like all about. So, and all of those hit the exact same time period when the Jesus movement was picking up speed. And I don't believe that the artist did it just to sell records. I don't believe that they did, other than Norman Greenbaum. He may have done it just for a record. I don't know. But none of these artists needed to try and grab another audience. None of these artists needed to get out of their own genre, they had their following. They had their fans. And it's almost like writing a song like that or doing a song like that could have alienated some of their fans. They could have lost fans for writing a song like this. But there was no thought on it. It's just, that's what they did. And so the Jesus movement of the 1970s, showed us that, hey, if we as the church actually go out and share the love of Jesus and show people how we can use our secular gifts for the glory of God, that wow, you can change the world, because that's how this started. This started by a couple preachers going out into the street and talking to guys with guitars. That's how this started. And out of it, an entire denomination, multiple denominations started that still last today. One being, for if you watch this later on YouTube and you're not from this area, one being just a few miles from the National Forest that broadcasts Christian music throughout the National Forest. And that, as people hear the message, they will see the seed planted. And so if it's possible for a seed to be planted in a Black Sabbath song, think about what might have been planted somewhere deep in your own heart, that there is a truth and a peace greater out there than what we know in this world. And I'm going to end it with that today, because I want to talk about, I only have a couple minutes left, and I want to talk about the growth of this ministry. And if it's laid on your heart, we have tithing, we have donation ability to do online. It's Tidiute Creek. I think you guys can see it on the screen. TidiuteCreek.org. You can go there, and there's a donate button, a faith offering button is what it's called. And for the church, because we want to keep growing this ministry. It's really something that's touched both Kathy and myself in a really positive way. I mean, it's brought new energy to what we're doing. And I feel like it's what we're supposed to be doing. And my hope is, and nothing against Facebook Live, but my hope is that we can take this beyond Facebook Live. There are a lot of people, out there that we're not reaching right now because they're not on Facebook. There are people who have specifically asked us about when they can hear what's going on, because they don't do Facebook. And so that's why one reason I rebroadcast everything on YouTube. But I would love for us to be able to get to the point where we can broadcast this on a platform other than Facebook, where we'll be able to reach more people regularly and continue to grow this. And I wasn't going to share that. I wasn't going to talk about that, the fact that we need, and this is why I'm bringing up the whole YouTube thing, is if you're listening to this on Facebook Live right now, or if you are listening to the rebroadcast on YouTube and you did not click on the subscribe button, for us to be able to do all that, we have to have subscribers on YouTube. And we have to show YouTube that we are building that platform. And right now our numbers are not close to where they need to be for us to do that. So it's my prayer, and this is like a God-sized prayer, is that even though it won't put us exactly where we need to be, my prayer is that we're going to get 500 subscribers by the end of the year on the Faith in the Forest YouTube channel. And so I'm imploring you guys, it costs you nothing to just share this and talk to people about it, and get people to subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's the only way we're going to be able to grow outside of the confines we are right now, and I trust God that it's going to happen. And here's why I share that. I went up and helped out. I did a talk for a men's golf retreat at Wesley Woods, and as I was leaving there Friday night, I was driving slow because of all the deer. I flipped the radio on, and Dr. David Jeremiah was on, who preaches out of Shadow Mountain Community Church. And he was talking about how his love was always radio, but he followed God's plan, and he went to seminary and had a couple different churches, and then he ended up at Shadow Mountain and started doing just basically a Sunday small group study kind of thing on local radio, sort of like what we're doing right now. And he just followed that passion of, this is where he felt like he was supposed to be all along. It all started with him wanting to be on radio, and he followed the path of ministry, ended up back on radio, and now Shadow Mountain is broadcast in multiple languages across the world. And it was all him just following his passion of what he felt he was supposed to be doing and sharing the truth of Jesus Christ. That's where Kathy and I are right now, and we want to be able to keep doing it, but we need help. We need help growing this ministry. So please share it, pray about it, and if it's on your heart, get up to the Grange Hall this morning. And we'll do a live message on the book of Acts. And with that, I bid you all farewell until next week when we get into the next part of the gospel and rock and roll, which we're about to wrap this up. We only have 2 or 3 weeks left of the gospel and rock and roll. And so next week, we're just going to touch on some of the contemporary, modern music, pop music. We're going to touch through a few songs and talk about them and how they touched society and how prayerfully it's touching your heart that Jesus is just all right with all of us. Amen? All right. Be safe, everybody. Bye.